The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches, 1984. All things in nature incessantly work on one another. Goethe, The Experiment as Mediator Between Object and Subject, 1792. To think with an enlarged mentality means that one trains one's imagination to go visiting. Hannah Arendt, Lectures on Kant's Political Philosophy, 1975-1982. This is my abstract. It communicates everything I want you to understand, without words. I wish you could touch it, stand under it, move around it, smell it. For now, take a minute to observe. What do you discover? This is also my abstract. It communicates everything I want you to understand, without words. I wish you could walk through it, feel the rough bark with your hands, lie on your back and find yourself in awe. Inhale the air around it. Listen to the hemlock trees. Make no sound. For now, take a minute to observe. What do you discover? This too is my abstract. It communicates everything I want you to understand, without words. I wish you could smooth your hands over it, or maybe your cheek or the soles of your feet, without crushing, recording the texture in your body, mind, for later consideration, or even dreaming. Stick your nose into it, inhaling gently, so not to disturb. Lie your ear upon it to see if there are tiny sounds. Look very closely, maybe with a microscope, to see all the living beings within it. Sit very close by and among it, and allow the space inside your chest and all the human mechanisms within slow to the pace of these beings making space. For now, take a minute to observe. What do you discover? Here is my abstract, written and reductionistic. Designers might create more mutualistic designs which foster coexistence rather than domination over the natural environment, if they understood the built environment as largely created by species and forces other than human, and, if built by humans, as co-opted opportunistically by other species and forces soon after they are built by humans. To begin to comprehend requires new, yet only new to our contemporary human selves, forms of learning and understanding, and will demand of us to reach out to humans we may largely ignore or other. But let's first examine and explode our common assumptions. The common definition for the built environment, quote, refers to the human-made environment that provides the setting for human activity, unquote, according to Wikipedia, or are, quote, man-made structures, features, and facilities viewed collectively as an environment in which people live and work, unquote, Oxford Languages. These definitions are unapologetically anthropocentric, yet the definition of build is, quote, construct something by putting parts or material together, unquote, and, quote, environment is the surroundings or conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives or operates, unquote. Why is the built environment only the domain of humans? It is arrogant and marginalizes other species in their intelligence, their power, their agency, their right to inhabit the world alongside and with we humans. Who is doing the building, and for whom? Once it is built, it is a space. For whom? For what? Build. Notice, the definition does not include humans. Could we say, the hummingbird nest was built summer of 2020? The hemlock forest was built starting 100 years ago and continues. The lichen has been and will be building forever. Let's move on to the second word under scrutiny, environment. These definitions include other beings and could include biogeochemical forms too. Quote, the surroundings or conditions in which a person, animal, plant, air, water, geology, aka elements and atoms and energy, lives or operates. Water rushing downstream may not be operating, but it is operated upon by gravity. Gravity is operating on the water, which then operates on the rocks and soil. Gravity is operating on the water, the rocks, the soil to make a river. Gravity has agency. Gravity is a builder. If we start to see the world as mostly built by other species and forces, what do we then see? What do we experience as designers and architects when we see that way? How do we feel? What is our experience when we move through it? If we can retain this felt experience in our minds and bodies, how then might we design? Imagine the built environment as you have known it. A city, perhaps, built by humans. How do you move through this space? What do you sense from this type of built environment? How does it make you feel? Is it mutable? Is it constant? How does the urban built environment frame itself and your experience of it? Now imagine the built environment which species other than human build. Take a second. How do you move through it? What do you sense? What do you come to realize, understanding it as a built environment? How do we begin to learn from this other than human built environment? I am sure many of you have witnessed the genius of species making nests and homes, which we've likely seen, if not in person, in documentaries on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter and such. So that is old news. But what happens to us as designers when we see specific trees as building their environment, or communities of lichen, or varieties of mosses, or gravity operating on water? How does this change us? How does this change our work? Does this experiential understanding alter our perception from the unilateral and unidirectional to the multilateral and multidirectional? From humans building upon and using the substrate of the world to create a built environment intentionally and mostly designed for humans, unintentionally designed for species of all kinds. 2. Humans as one species in a gigantic crowd of species and biogeochemical forces that build integratively and collectively, multilaterally and multidirectionally with substrate, which is, in fact, the gigantic crowd. A tree makes leaves. The leaves, with microbial and geochemical assistance, make soil, a kitchen of sorts. A seed falls in, a guest, and is fed nutrients made available by microbes, chefs who not unselfishly feed others while feeding themselves, while fungal spores lightly land and weave dendritic subterranean fungal webs which are passages between kitchen and dining room and serve in both directions, food, water, minerals, and general support to the seed, carbohydrates to the fungi. Imagine the guest enjoying a meal while ensuring the server is also fed. Does it make us feel small, humbled, ridiculous, arrogant, selfish? Note: substrate definition: the surface or material on or from which an organism lives, grows, or obtains its nourishment. Another way into this mental and hopefully embodied and full sensory challenge is to consider how our designs are co-opted opportunistically by multi-species builders using materials we have unintentionally laid out for them to use. Dirk Hebel, architect and professor of sustainable construction at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, Germany, asks, quote, can the waste state of a product become the starting point of its design proper? Hebel, 2014. And Vincent Desprez, philosopher of science and associate professor at the University of Liège, proposes that, quote, to make two worlds live together in an intelligent way not only means thinking and connecting with what is required in this cohabitation, but just as much in taking an interest in what it invents and metamorphoses into, unquote. Desprez, 2016. Humans make buildings and structures. Almost immediately they are co-opted by species and forces which, I argue, are building anew using the materials we have unwittingly proffered. Architects Alejandro Bajamon and artist Maria Camila Sanjines point out in Rematerial from Waste to Architecture, quote, the design team must first identify the sources of materials suitable for reutilization and then start to define the details, unquote. Bajamon, Sanjines, 2014. What if we acknowledged and recognized the agency of multi-species, quote, design teams, unquote, who seem to be excellent at identifying sources of materials, whether we provide them or not, which are suitable for reutilization? I wonder, do they already know the details? What is the multi-species design team's process when defining the details? Do they already know? Or do they work through the details just as we do, changing when obstacles arise? Bear with me, this is going to be long. A side note on the use of language. There, they, it, or nature, in reference to all species and forces, lumps multitudes into, quote, one that is not human, unquote. The mental image when using there, they, it, or nature in reference to the infinitely differentiated life forms and forces is idiotically reductionistic and does not begin to do justice to this crowd that inhabits the earth. Of course, the crowd may not care. Here, while Kate Soper doesn't excuse othering, she pardons humans and our conceptual anthropocentricity as long as we are aware of the human lens through which we see and understand and its limits. Quote, I think we have to be clear that we have no conception of what the difference of nature consists in other than in the conceptions we have of its difference. All representations of nature are thus far discursively mediated, and they are all informed to some degree by the ideas we have of human identity. In this sense, there is no escaping conceptual anthropocentricity, but nor is there anything deplorable about this. The fact, for example, that we cannot speak for inorganic nature, or interpret the beings and needs of non-human creatures other than in the light of our own identity, is neither the cause of distress nor for giving up on the exercise of representation. All it means is that in any understanding we bring to the modes of representation, we need to be aware of the limits of that understanding. Unquote. Soper, 1998. Edith Stein, 1891 to 1942, early phenomenologist who worked for, was suppressed by, and supplied Edmund Husserl with many of his ideas, wrote, long before Soper, that we cannot, quote, cancel, unquote, our experience at understanding phenomenon. Quote, what is not subject to doubt is my experience of the thing, the perception, memory, or other kind of comprehension, together with its correlate, the full phenomenon of the thing, unquote. Stein, 1989. Quote, I, the experiencing subject who considers the world and my now person as phenomenon, I am an experience and only in it, am just as indubitable and impossible to cancel as experience itself. Stein, 1989. To use there, they, it is the way many Western European non-indigenous humans experience that which is not themselves. When we are close in observing those beings and phenomena unlike ourselves, we bring othering for distinction. It is not us. For the purpose of this representation, and writing as the mode of representation in the narrative, I am using the reductionistic and othering terms they, their, it, To delve into concepts of oneness means we must change our language, strive for empathy, and rupture and reinvent our ways of understanding. Despite all this, Soper and Stein would both argue that even as we might feel oneness with all beings and things, we are still in our human experience. For now, I am making the distinction, human, other than human, in striving to address our traditional and entrenched contemporary human perspective without entangling the writing in confusing inventive language such as Donna Haraway might use. I would like this work to connect to human understanding at the very least. Otherwise, it's opaque, communicates only to a certain academic clique, and therefore pointless. Cheryl Bartlett, Canadian biologist who focused on the practice of merging both indigenous knowledge and westernized scientific knowledge, suggests we try, quote, two-eyed seeing, unquote, to better understand the world. Quote, learning to see from one eye with the strengths of the best in indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eyes with the strengths of the best in Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and to using both eyes together for the benefit of all. Thus, two-eyed seeing intentionally and respectfully brings together our different knowledges and ways of knowing to motivate people, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike, to use all our gifts so we leave the world a better place. Unquote. Bartlett, 2007. Traditional ecological knowledge is, Robin Kimmerer writes, quote, proudly subjective, qualitative, holistic, long-term relational knowledge which encompasses mind, body, emotion, and spirit. Unquote. Kimmerer, 2013. Scientific ecological knowledge, quote, adheres to its tradition of being proudly objective, quantitative, short-term, reductionistic, materialistic knowledge which privileges its intellectual schema for strictly empirical knowledge. Unquote. Kimmerer, 2013. Because, quote, there is much which exists which we do not know and cannot measure yet, unquote, Robin Kimmerer suggests that science, and I propose designers, found their work on the humility arising from the, quote, recognition of the limits of human observation, unquote, Kimmerer, 2013, which is in agreement with Soper's argument mentioned earlier. We cannot, quote, interpret non-human creatures other than in the light of our own identity, unquote, Soper, 1998. If we dismiss that which we can't comprehend, abandon humility, or replace, quote, respect, responsibility, and wonder with arrogance and hubris, unquote, then our, quote, very productivity endangers life rather than sustains it, unquote. Kimmerer, 2013. Design productivity has endangered a lot of life. However, as designers who help build the world, we can strive for empathetic awakening to its entirely different perspectives from our human condition with full acknowledgement of our limitations to interpret the beings and needs with humility. Here, design has the opportunity to employ two-eyed seeing, the merging of scientific knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing to learn from and work with multi-species and biogeochemical designers and builders of the world's environments. But first, designers might begin with Robin Kimmerer's list in which scientific inquiry, and I will add design inquiry, is guided by indigenous principles. We might consider these questions to begin envisioning such a symbiosis, such as, does the inquiry create respect for human and non-human persons alike? Or does the inquiry generate reciprocity, the understanding that any taking must be compensated by giving in return? Or is the inquiry based on responsibility for active participation in the well-being of the natural world? Or maybe, does the work recognize the land as teacher and access intelligences other than our own? There are many more. Donna Haraway and Vinciane Desprez, critical thinkers in philosophy and anthropology of science, offered the idea of visiting, based on indigenous ways of knowing, to tackle this challenge of learning from the co-builders of the world. Designers, take note. Haraway writes of Vinciane Desprez, "She trains her whole being, not just her imagination, to go visiting. Visiting is not an easy practice. It demands the ability to find others actively interesting, even or especially others most people already claim to know all too completely. To ask questions that one's interlocutors truly find interesting. To cultivate the wild virtue of curiosity. To retune one's ability to sense and respond. And to do all this politely." Unquote. Haraway, 2016. And here's a third way into understanding the multi-species designer. The contemporary hunter who hunts by foot and uses smell, sound, sight, instinct, experience, memory. Interestingly, this group of humans is often politically at odds with Haraway's very specific and exclusive congregation of human kin, who are, quote, anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, pro-queer feminists of every color and from every people, unquote, and include non-human species such as pigeons. Haraway, 2016. Often the hunter is lumped among another type of human, perhaps a human who has more children, or goes to church, votes Republican, or Libertarian. Yet hunters who hunt by foot and for food for their families are closer to indigenous ways of knowing than philosophers whose experience is largely academic and removed. Michael Pollan writes, quote, "The hunter instinctively becomes more like the animal, straining to make himself less visible, less audible, more exquisitely alert. Predator and prey alike move according to their own maps of this ground, their own forms of attention, and their own systems of instinct." Unquote. Pollan, 2006. Designers can learn much if they choose to spend time with a hunter hunting. It is a practice of alertness. In making effort to begin to understand multi-species designers and the built environment as built by multitudes, a beautiful and enchanting side effect may be that humans may build bridges of understanding between each other.